Good evening, everyone. Professor Scott Morton, Senior, Professor Scott Morton, Junior, Professor Scharf, distinguished guests, ladies, gentlemen, and assorted riffraff. Welcome to tonight's event. Welcome to our modest Playfair Library here at the University of Edinburgh. The electricity is broken, apparently, and there's going to be no lighting. So they tell me tonight's lecture is going to be held under ambient lighting, which I think is code for it's going to be pitch dark. This promises to be quite an occasion, not least because it's our first in-person get-together since COVID began. And it's wonderful that we have such a distinguished speaker tonight in the form of Professor Scott Morton, Jr. Now, you may wonder why I'm going through this palaver of Professor Scott Morton, Sr. and Professor Scott Morton, Jr. Well, Fiona's father, Michael, is here tonight, and we welcome him most warmly. And I should say, before I talk about Fiona, that Michael is Scottish and studied at the University of Glasgow, but we can forgive him that, before leaving for the United States, where I presume Fiona was born. But Fiona herself has deep Scottish roots through Michael. And it's terrific that they're both here this evening. Fiona is the Theodore Nierenberg Professor at Yale University. She has an extraordinarily distinguished career. She began as an undergraduate also at Yale University before going on to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for her PhD. Now, I should say two things about MIT. First of all, it was, in those days, and still is, the finest economics department in the world. So to get in at all to do postgraduate studies, or graduate studies, as the Americans call it, is quite an achievement. And secondly, another fact about MIT is it's where Professor Scott Morton, Sr. works. After graduating with her PhD from MIT in 1994, Fiona went on to work at all the illustrious departments of economics that you could fit onto one hand. She went to Stanford, Chicago, and then back to Yale, where she, as I've just explained, holds and has held a full professorship for many years, a named chair for many years. In her career, she's played an important role in public life as well as in academic life. Between the years of 2011 and 12, she was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economics in the Department of Justice in the United States, which is an extremely high-powered role. Now, how do we know of Fiona? Because, and I wasn't on the other end of the phone, I don't think, but at some point around 2004, Fiona approached us and asked if she could come to visit the Department of Economics at the University of Edinburgh. It wasn't called the School of Economics in those days. We couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe our luck. We had no idea that she had these Scottish roots. And naturally enough, we welcomed her with open arms. And she became the Adam Smith Visiting Fellow for a year. During that, before she arrived, I should say that we were all rather terrified, worrying that we wouldn't be able to keep up with her academically. But quite quickly, she put us at our ease, and dare I say, she really fitted in with us being a group of economists who, by intention, straddle the boundary between applied and theory, and the boundary between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Now, there are not many visitors like Fiona who would come in and fit in quickly into that rather sort of interstices environment, but she did because she had the extraordinary gift of being able to say subtle ideas, especially about how to do and how not to do applied work. Had a knack of being able to explain those subtle ideas in the simplest ways that even theorists like myself could latch onto. And we loved having her in our community, and she added so richly to our menu of skills. Naturally enough, we were extremely keen that she should stay. We offered her every inducement we could dream of to get her not to go back to America, but we failed. On the other hand, the good news was that she, because of her Scottish roots and perhaps because she was fond of us, decided to maintain a relationship with the now School of Economics and has been a visiting professor here since 2008. So we're welcoming Fiona back tonight. As I said at the start, it couldn't be a more auspicious moment to welcome her back because it's the first time that many of us have even been in the same room. So thank you, Fiona, so much for coming. And let me restate what we've said many times to you. As soon as you get fed up with the United States, you come back here and there's a job waiting for you. So thank you so much indeed, Fiona.
Well, I don't think ever in my life I will have an introduction as warm and long as that one. Thank you, John. That was extremely kind, and is extremely kind. All right, let me pull up my talk here. Okay, so in the remaining short amount of time that I have to deliver this lecture, what I thought I would do is talk about the modern situation with regard to competition enforcement and try to do that in a somewhat mid-Atlantic way, covering both the European Union, the UK, and the US. I guess first I should also say that it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here talking to you. John is right. I am very fond of this department and the university more generally. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Okay. Why is it important to think about this topic? Economic research has influenced competition enforcement in the past, and I think the potential for influencing it in the future is really very high right now. And the linkage is critical both on the agency side and the research side. The agencies want to follow the research so that they get the right answer for any given problem. And they care about that because that affects real outcomes, innovation, prices, and consumer welfare. And then the need for and use of research and enforcement is important for researchers so that they can work on problems that are not only difficult intellectually, but responsive to the needs of the society in which they live. And agencies obviously can't rely on research that hasn't been done. So we have to step up and produce that. I want to begin with a little bit of history. I have a paper with Herb Hovenkamp. The sites are on the slide, and I'm going to talk about some historical background for a bit and not really use the slides until I get to the papers. If you go back and think about post-war competition enforcement, in the European Union, the idea was to integrate and have free trade among the member states, and so you need markets to be open, and flourishing competition was a bit of a side benefit to having all of that competition, to having all of that trade. In the US, after World War II, we had an interventionist antitrust regime that was worried about large firms. And this was a time of growth of national brands, advertising, R&D. Think of John Sutton's work and that kind of consolidation driven by those factors. Neither jurisdiction had good economics at this time. In the EU, there was the ordo-liberal tradition, which said the state is going to control industry to a certain extent, and we're going to make a list of prohibited practices. No economics really needed. And in the United States, we had the Harvard School and the Chicago School. The Harvard School said every industry is different and we don't have any analytical tools yet, 1940s and 50s, that was true. But the Harvard School also developed the structure, conduct, performance paradigm, which said that the structure of an industry led to its conduct, led to its performance. The IO literature of the 1980s demonstrated that this approach is not correct because it treats an outcome, concentration, as an input, right? The structure causes conduct, causes performance. So that's not correct. Concentration is an equilibrium result that depends on how demand responds to advertising or R&D. Again, think about a Sutton-type model. A firm can achieve a large market share by excluding competitors, of course. It can also get it by being really good and attracting consumers. So the tricky part of competition enforcement is preventing the former with a rule and an enforcement procedure that doesn't falsely catch the latter. But if you just take a snapshot in the cross-section, it's hard to see. You just see market shares. So you need careful economics to tell them apart, and we didn't develop that until later in the 80s and 90s. In the 1970s, the Chicago School in the United States made its contribution, which did far more harm than structure, conduct, performance. Why? Because the animating purpose behind the Chicago School folks was less intervention by government in markets. They belonged to the Mount Pelerin Society, which was this conservative group. So that was the idea. The idea was not to get the right answer. The idea was to stop the state from intervening in markets. Now, if that's your goal, a slogan, more corporate profit, okay, is not really going to be a winning slogan. So they needed a different approach, and the approach that they settled on was, let's use economics to do competition enforcement. And that, as a marketing pitch, was really a fantastic idea, because a little bit of price theory, even the price theory of 1975, was really useful. It delivered some correct answers. And the first few of those answers actually were probably right in the 1970s, where a merger of a 4% firm with a 2% firm is unlikely to cause significant harm to consumers. So the Chicago people proved themselves with this way of doing antitrust, and they set out to convert the judiciary to their point of view. In addition, use economics to do competition enforcement was, of course, really popular with economists in academia. And they thought it was a great idea without, I think, fully realizing that courts in real life were going to have a hard time understanding and using these tools. And indeed, very quickly, the animating idea of the Chicago School overcame the economic principles. That is to say, economists invented new tools that showed that markets don't always self-correct and they don't always work very well. And market power can be created or maintained in ways that harm consumers. And Chicago School adherents simply ignored these advances in the field. So important advances like the game theory revolution in the 1980s. The court said tacit collusion cannot be achieved by an oligopoly, for example. Other important advances like the measurement of demand. I've been at talks where somebody says markets, the markups are too high. Your market definition is too narrow. Behavioral economics, more recently, markets always self-correct. Consumers will shift their demand to firms that have better offers because they're always neoclassical. So all those areas of thought were just skipped over by the Chicago School adherents, and they stuck to 1975 price theory, which was not always even right to begin with, but certainly not keeping up with advances in the field. So that is a huge problem in the United States because those ideas were inserted into the jurisprudence in the US with the help of think tanks and monopoly profits, really. And that became what people in law in the United States think economics is. Okay, it's a really big problem. And actually the people on the far left think that that's what economics is also. So the mainstream of the profession is completely unaware that the law thinks that economics is 1975 price theory and goes about writing papers and You write a paper and you put it in a journal, and the last paragraph has policy implications, and you write your paragraph on policy implications, and you say, well done me, I have communicated to the policymakers. And nothing of the sort has happened. You have to go out and write a law review article, or put a blog in a place where policymakers read it, or find somebody eminent in this sphere that you can co-author with and cross over into other domains where people can actually appreciate the insight in your paper, which of course no lawyer is ever going to read because it's too technical. So the economic ideas get parroted at legal events with no oversight from real economists, and they just move away from what we do. So US courts have done things that are, I'm about to tell you them, but they're hard to believe in a way. US courts have found that oligopolists are incapable of tacit collusion, that exclusion of a rival platform is pro-competitive as long as the dominant firm shares some of its profits with one side of the platform, that the court looked into the eyes of the manager and he promised to keep competing hard, so the court is sure that competition will be fine and not lessened by the merger. Courts have just really abandoned the economics that you would recognize. Now, in the EU, the ordo-liberal tradition, as I said, doesn't really allow for economics to be included, so courts didn't have a chance to abandon it or even opine very much, which might be a good thing. But the downside to the EU system is that it's more like a list of rules from the civil law tradition. So you make a list of things that aren't allowed, and enforcement is simply a court determining whether the firm did one of the things on the list. And this method, of course, can also lead to poor outcomes for consumers because perhaps the rules are not perfect, or indeed different settings demand different rules, and so you don't get ideal outcomes that way. Courts do still make mistakes. I would say that the Intel judgment on rebates and loyalty rebates is widely viewed by many economists to be pretty misguided. So why has enforcement also failed in Europe? I think the answer is that the remedies are extremely, extremely slow. The cases are very slow, the remedies are slow, and the remedies are poor. So think about the fact that the first Google search case began in 2010, and it's still ongoing. There were hearings today about what to do about Android and how to change market structure, which there is no change in market structure. Google still has a 95% share in the search market. So why are the remedies such a problem? Well, the commission asks the firm that's been found liable to design a remedy. That is an obvious incentive problem with that. And then goes out and market tests it with competitors and asks them what they think of the remedy and what improvements they could make. Well, there's an obvious incentive problem with that too. So the result is that consumer interests are not really given much weight, and the process is extremely slow. So despite having done the analysis to bring the case and find liability, the commission doesn't then provide parameters for what to do about it when they get to the end. The commission has fines, but it's very difficult to rely on fines once the problem has gotten to a certain size. So remember, to deter behavior, a fine has to be equivalent to the illegally gained profits grossed up by the chance of being caught. So in other words, if I'm going to make $30 billion by my illegal behavior, but I only have a fine of $30 billion won't deter me if there's only a 20% chance that I'm going to be caught. You'd have to fine me $150 billion. Well, $150 billion is almost the size of Scottish GDP. So agencies probably don't have the authority for those fines, and a court might well say that's not proportionate. So a fine is hard to make work, and structural remedies, the EU doesn't use structural remedies. I'm not quite sure whether they're unwilling or they don't have the legal authority, but divesting Android from Google, for example, and making Android be a regulated standalone entity would be a good solution, and that doesn't seem to be on the table. So there's a very long introduction, like John's, but here we are, and the conclusion is for the last 40 years, in both the United States and the European Union, while the UK was part of the European Union, we have seen a broad failure of competition enforcement for different reasons in the two places, but I think failure is not too strong a word. This is very disappointing intellectually to IO economists, including myself. It's obviously more than disappointing to end consumers, as it causes them economic harm, and also contributes to income inequality, because when you have corporate profits, the corporate profits accrue to the top 1 to 5% of the income distribution, wealth distribution, while the bottom 95% are paying higher prices. So competition enforcement failure increases in wealth inequality. Now, I'll note that I have worked on some of the cases that I mentioned above. For example, I served as the economic expert for the states that sued to block the Sprint T-Mobile merger. I worked for Apple when they were suing Qualcomm, and I have consulted for Amazon on antitrust matters, and I just finished testifying for the FTC in the Illumina Grail merger, which is really an interesting case of innovation. So I'm happy to take questions about the testifying economist's role at the end of the talk. But we're in a social moment where this topic, competition, is of general interest, which is kind of amazing. That's never happened to me in my career up till now. We finally worked out that there's a problem, and it's being discussed by the media, by regular people, by academic economists. And that's happened simultaneously with an awakening among IO researchers as to the lack of competition in many markets and documenting that. And the research in the last 7 years has been strikingly different to, I would say, the previous 20. So who changed this paradigm? I have to give a shout out to our macro and finance colleagues who recognized the issue of the lack of competition at a macro level, the rising profit share in the economy, the decline in the labor share. And they started collecting data and writing papers. And some of those papers just repeated the IO mistakes from the 1970s, and so people in my field got all outraged and said, who are these interlopers coming in trying to do our job for us? But of course, there was not enough recognition that if there's a question of social interest and you're not answering it, someone else is going to come along and try to answer it. So that's, that was our fault. And we were estimating demand for different flavors of yogurt, and that's just not very interesting. So now I think that did cause an uptick in more interesting questions, but not at the typically macro level, but again at the industry, more focused industry level where we can make more progress. So let me tell you about a few papers that have really changed the debate. And I'm going to start with healthcare. Remember, in the United States, healthcare is mostly a for-profit business. So dialysis clinics are for-profit private firms. And dialysis is the process of having your blood cleaned by a machine, which you need if your liver has failed. And you also get epogen typically to keep your blood count high enough. So this paper by a group of authors from Duke looks at what happens when a small dialysis clinic is acquired by a chain. We have 2 big chains in the United States. And what you see in the graph is that the amount of this drug given to the patient goes up considerably. Well, at this time, the Medicare regulations allowed for the firm to make money off of the drug. Essentially, the drug maker paid a kickback to the clinic. So it was very profitable for the clinic to inject people with more drugs. And there's a safe level of drug, and after the mergers, the amount of drug given went up, as you can see there, and what the paper shows is there were more strokes and more deaths among the patients that attended these clinics. So that's an example of a merger that doesn't raise prices because Medicare is paying for most of these people, so the price is regulated, but it obviously harms the consumer. Now what I've done is tried to put the PhD year of the authors as I go through these so that you can understand how young most of them are. This Duke group is a little bit older than average, but this is to inspire all the PhD students in the room to write these papers. Okay, so next just is another set of drugs. This is quite an interesting paper. They have 2 other drugs that dialysis patients get are substitutes. You can give them either one, and the way the regulations worked, the one on the left was very profitable for the clinic, and the one on the right was not. And so the minute the clinic is merged into the chain, they're told switch over to the one that makes more money. And again, survival rates fall among these patients, so it's not good. Okay, the next paper I want to talk about is by Tom Woolman at the University of Chicago with a great title, How to Get Away with Merger. Okay, and this is also dialysis clinics. And what he has is a data set of mergers again. And remember, because you have to go get dialysis twice a week, you don't want to drive really far. So there's a geographic market for dialysis clinics as well as a product market. Obviously, there isn't a substitute for dialysis except a liver transplant. And there's so you have a product market that's well-defined and a geographic market that's well-defined. And the chains grew by purchasing clinics over time, and these mergers are all reviewed by the FTC. And when two clinics are in the same geography, let's call it a town, and want to merge, if there aren't enough other substitutes, the FTC will block that merger or require that the firms divest one of those clinics so that their market share in the town does not get so high. In most jurisdictions, and it's true in the United States, firms that want to merge are required to notify the competition authority in advance. In the United States, this is called an HSR filing. If your merger is big enough, over $90 million today, you have to file in advance, and you can't merge for 30 days. And then if the government objects, there's a process. But if you file, you know that the FTC is going to look at your merger. If your asset size is below $90 million, and you can fiddle with it a bit depending on how you classify debt, then you don't have to file an HSR filing, and instead you can simply merge right away. Okay? So a competition authority would have no reason to know about such a small merger in advance, and indeed might not even know about it afterwards unless they were purposefully looking around. So let's see what happens. This is from Tom's paper. If you look at the increase in market share, which is the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis is the probability that a divestiture is required. You can see that the reportable transactions, the ones that are bigger than $90 million, in any geography where the market shares get big, essentially the FTC makes you divest with probability 1. Okay, that red line is up, headed toward 1. Transactions that are exempt, that are not reported to the FTC, do not get told to divest no matter what their HHI change is. So in other words, you can merge to monopoly as long as you're below the $90 million because no one is paying attention. Now, what's interesting then is that Tom compares these two sets of, he takes the rule defined by the red line, which is what should be divested, and applies it to the blue line and asks, okay, what do we see in the blue line setting where there should have been a divestiture but wasn't? And let's take that as an experiment in the effect of a concentration. And what he finds is that, again, because Medicare pays for all of these dialysis patients, the price is fixed. He finds, like the first paper, nurses per patient go down, hospitalizations go up, deaths go up, technicians per machine go down. So there are not as much staff, they're not cleaning the machines as often, and people are dying or getting sick. So what do we learn from this, besides the fact that people are dying, getting sick, and that's bad? Firms carry out mergers that create market power the moment that they are not being scrutinized. That's profit maximizing. It's also legal. So I think for economists it's not surprising, but it is strenuously denied by the defense bar. Right? The fact that the blue line is there is something that firms would say doesn't happen. We wouldn't undertake an anti-competitive merger. And the paper shows that we're under-enforcing small mergers. Also, let me stress that this paper shows that harm can occur through a mechanism that is not price. And that's really important. I think sometimes merger enforcement and competition enforcement more generally is boiled down. We always convert everything to price, and we talk like that, and then people outside think we mean it, and they don't understand that we're talking about quality-adjusted price, and here we have an example where price is fixed, but quality is going down. And so that's another way. Sometimes courts get stuck on the idea that if prices don't rise, there can't be harm, and this is a nice example that shows that that's not true. Okay, more evidence that we have a problem. My own colleagues, Florian Ederer and Song Ma, have a recent paper in the Journal of Political Economy. The authors look at mergers between pharmaceutical companies. The FTC enforces in this area, and they're pretty good at taking all the existing drugs from the two firms and comparing which ones compete, and again, requiring a divestiture. I'll say as an aside, sometimes those divestitures are just of the drug and not of the associated business complementary assets. like manufacturing and R&D and all the marketing and things that go with that drug. So divesting just a drug is, I think, a little bit problematic. But anyway, they identify those drugs that are competing. What these authors do is look further down the development pathway into the pipeline of drugs that are still being developed. They identify nascent products, and they assign them a therapeutic class and a mechanism of action, and then they ask if the acquiring firm also competes in that therapeutic class with that mechanism of action. And they find that when there's an overlap, and that overlap includes a product that's still got some patent life on it, so the acquiring firm wants to keep selling that drug, then the acquiring firm is much more likely to shut down the research project, to just kill off the nascent project. And the empirical, so what we learn from this is that we've been under-enforcing in pharmaceutical mergers because we've been ignoring the impact of nascent competitors and the impact that these acquisitions can have on R&D. So this is a whole area. Of course, these authors got invited to present their work at the FTC and the CMA and every possible competition authority because everybody realized, oh, we could have been studying this and we didn't. The data's right there. The second thing that we learned from this paper is really interesting. Okay, here are, I told you before about the reportable transactions and the HSR threshold. The distance to the HSR threshold is on the horizontal axis, so there's a 0 at 90 million, and there's the transactions on either side, and you can see that the vertical axis is just telling you how many of them there are, and you can see that doesn't look like much of a pattern for the non-overlapping acquisitions. Now let's think about what's happening for the overlapping acquisitions where there's a nascent product in the pipeline. Okay, look at where they all are, right underneath 0. These are all transactions at $89 million when the reportable threshold is at $90 million. So what does that tell you? That tells you that these managers know exactly what they're doing. That if they had a transaction that was $91 million, they would have to file it with the FTC. The FTC might look and see what they're doing and stop them. So it's one thing to say, well, I don't like scrutiny from the FTC. I should have all my transactions be $89 million. Then you'd see the same picture in both frames. But in fact, we only see the pileup when there's a competitive problem. All right, so once again, we've been under-enforcing, and the firms understand this and are taking advantage of it. Another really great paper that's quite recent is by Nate Miller and Matt Weinberg. Nate was at the Department of Justice as an economist when I was there and left to join the faculty of Georgetown University and just has some absolutely fantastic new papers, and just one of them. But because he worked in enforcement, he understands where good questions lie, and that's actually something that I think is really good. The FTC is trying to have more visiting, and DOJ both, visiting economists, and I think that's something that is worth thinking about for every competition authority because it seeds ideas that are useful. So what do they study? They study a joint venture in 2008 between Miller and Coors, two makers of what they call beer, but really is beer-flavored water in the United States. And so Miller and Coors did a joint venture, and the idea was that that would enable them to be bigger and have economies of scale and compete with Anheuser-Busch. And the Department of Justice approved it on the grounds that cost reductions in brewing and transportation of the beer would outweigh any anti-competitive effects. And what the paper shows is that there's an abrupt increase in retail beer prices after this joint venture takes place. And in later antitrust litigation that I was actually at DOJ for, it was unrelated, but publicly some documents came out that described the goal of Anheuser-Busch's pricing practices as yielding the highest level of followership in the short term. And by followership, they meant their competitors following them. And, quote, improving competitor conduct over the long term, unquote. So that raises the very possible importance of tacit collusion in the US beer industry. And so the authors set up a differentiated product pricing model that includes a conduct parameter. And the conduct parameter is going to measure the amount of cooperation between Miller Coors and Anheuser-Busch. It's a kind of an internal, how much of their profits do they internalize. The other two competitors, Grupo Modelo and Heineken, the other biggest ones, are assumed to play non-cooperatively. And because the market shares of all four vary across cities in the United States, and you've got some playing cooperatively and some not, and this one-time shift with the joint venture, the authors are able to estimate the extent of cooperation. And I'll show you a picture from this one. Okay, so on the left, you have the prices of Anheuser-Busch and Coors beer. And you can see right around the joint venture, there's a blip down, and then prices go back up again. On the left-hand, well, there's a little bit of a trend down, and then the jump up. On the right-hand side, you have Corona, which is a Mexican beer company at that time, and Heineken, a Dutch company, and their prices just keep trending down. So they test and reject the hypothesis that the price increases can be explained by movement from one Nash-Bertrand equilibrium to another, and they do some counterfactual simulations and determine that prices are 6 to 8% higher than they would have been without the joint venture, and markups are 17% higher than they would have been without the joint venture. So here we have an example of coordinated effects being under-enforced by the agencies. Okay, in case you are not convinced yet, here's one more. Okay, we're going to talk about monopsony. So during my career, for some reason, the labor economists that I knew all thought that labor markets worked and were competitive, and we never heard about monopsony. I mean, you learned it kind of in the textbook and then left it behind. And there's a really nice new paper by Ellie Prager and Matt Schmidt that looks at hospital mergers and examines the impact of the hospital mergers on 3 kinds of workers in the hospital. Low-skill workers that do things like laundry and cafeteria and so on that are, undifferentiated across industry. High-skill workers that are non-healthcare, like the accounting and strategy departments. And then high-skill workers that are healthcare workers, like nurses and pharmacists. And what they find is that wage growth slows for that last group particularly, some for the middle group, but most the high-skilled industry-specific healthcare workers are harmed when the transaction it has enough concentration, creates enough concentration to reduce their outside options. So this is the nursing and pharmacy wage over time with the merger at 0. They look at a variety of other explanations and decide that, and say the evidence is most consistent with that really a change in the market power of the labor, the bargaining power of labor. They don't find any change in output. So it looks like the monopsony power is not being exercised by walking down the supply curve, but just by bargaining and getting lower wages out of the bargaining environment. And that is confirmed by comparing this effect in states in the United States that are more pro-union and states that are more anti-union. And the effect is bigger in the anti-union states and is mitigated in the pro-union states. So it looks like the bargaining power of labor is really important in delivering this result. Here we see that mergers can harm input suppliers. This is not something that's enforced in the United States really at all, certainly not protecting labor. And many people, since these kinds of results started to come out, have called for labor markets to be part of merger review. There is a school of thought or people who say, oh, the lower wages are good because they mean lower costs, and that means the hospital services will cost less, and that'll help consumers. I think that depends on a couple of assumptions about pass-through, for example, on the part of the monopsonist. But more importantly, there's a dynamic harm. If you're going to pay the nurse less than the competitive wage of the nurse, then you're not going to get enough people investing in nurses. So in the long run, there's going to be an output problem. In the short run, maybe you can reallocate surplus away from nurses towards the shareholders of the hospital. But in the longer run, you're going to have a problem with investment in nursing. And the same people who are in favor of exercising monopoly power to lower costs are also the people who say, well, we have to give Apple dynamic incentives to invest in an iPad by having large markups. Otherwise, we'll have dynamic inefficiency. So those markups are good. Okay, so you can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're going to say dynamic efficiency in terms of investment is good for the corporation, it's also, I think, good for the worker. Okay, and another one on labor, which I just love, is by Evan Starr. He's at the University of Maryland, again, very young. And he has this paper looking at the state of Oregon that banned non-competes. So what is a non-compete? You flip burgers for McDonald's, and the employment contract says that you will not go work at another McDonald's, okay? Or even sometimes another burger restaurant within X miles. Now, we know that these can be efficient if you're a doctor who's invented a surgical technique and you want to teach it to someone and you'd like them to set up in a different city than you. But flipping a burger is not really the place where we think the efficiency arguments are going to work too well. So what Starr and Lipsitz do is they look at low-wage hourly workers in Oregon before and after the ban. And what they find is that banning the non-competes increase hourly wages by 2 to 3% on average, but because only a subset of workers are subject to those NCAs, that implies that it's about a 15% wage increase for the workers for the subset of workers that are subject to an NCA, giving like a 3% average effect. And the effects are stronger for female workers and in occupations where there are more non-compete agreements. Interestingly, also, you have big changes in mobility. These workers change jobs more frequently, and that makes tons of sense because you can leave the one McDonald's and be an assistant manager at the next one, and then move up to a manager at the other one. And it doesn't, and more hourly workers move to being salaried workers because the salaried workers are allowed to have a non-compete, and the hours worked doesn't seem to go down. So it's all a story that prohibiting these contracts was really stopping employers from having to compete for workers. And when you ban the contract term, the workers have more choice and their wages go up and they move around to find a better match. And the efficiency justification at this end of the income distribution is pretty trivial. So that's a set of work, and that's the, you can't see very well. So the circle is Oregon, and there's a control group that doesn't really show up on the slide, so you'll have to go look at the paper and see that the control group is below Oregon. But here, this one's a little bit better. In blue, we have the sample of workers that have high non-compete agreements, and the black is the Oregon workers that have low non-compete agreements. And before the red vertical dash line that you can barely see is the moment when there's the banning of the contract. So it hovers around 0 until then, and then you can see the blue line takes off. So that's wages increasing after the contracts are banned. So that's a set of papers that has, I think, really changed the terms of the debate in the United States by saying, look, we have proven that there's insufficient competition enforcement in labor markets, tacit collusion, unilateral effects, nascent competition, a bunch of areas where authorities have just fallen down on the job. So where do we need to push the ball forward in terms of doing more research? There's a couple of areas that I think are particularly important where we probably are also falling down on the job, but we don't know enough yet, and we need more, agencies need more help. Oops, did I do this in the wrong order? I'm going to do it this way. So the first paper I wanted to talk about is my friend Monika Schnitzer and co-authors in Germany look at Bell Labs back in 1956. Bell Labs and AT&T, remember, was a vertically integrated monopolist that did long distance. Remember those fixed line phones we used to have? So long distance, local, and also they made the telephone equipment. And Bell was forced to license all of its existing patents in 1956, including both telecommunications and non-telecommunications patents. And the authors look at follow-on innovation based on those those patents, and they show that the consent decree led to a lasting increase in the rate of innovation and patenting, but only in non-telecommunications sectors. And that was driven by young and small firms. So what it seems to be is that when these patents are released, that's an entry barrier. The young small firms come in and they start innovating, but they don't enter in telecommunications because there's a giant monopolist still owning the equipment, running the long distance, running the local service, and so innovating there doesn't make much sense. And so you call that foreclosure, you could call that the impact of the monopolist on innovation. But what we often or sometimes hear from Bell Labs and Bell and now Microsoft and others, Google, we're a monopolist and we do great innovation, okay? And that actually is not supported by the literature. And now we're starting to have some literature that's pushing back the other way and saying, actually, more competition is better for innovation. The last paper I want to talk about is one that I've written the first draft of, but we need to revise and send out with my PhD student. Well, he's now at Duke, but he was at Yale for a while. And what we are looking at here is common ownership. Common ownership has occurred because the consider that, say, in 1980, mutual funds held less than 10% of the US stock market. Now mutual funds are at more than 70% of the US stock market. And you might wonder if there's a competition implication from that massive shift, because what you have is owners that own many of the same product market competitors. If I'm Vanguard, I own Coke and Pepsi. If I'm Fidelity, I own Coke and Pepsi. If I am Wellington Fund, I own Coke and Pepsi. And Coke and Pepsi compete in the product market. So those owners have an incentive to soften competition in the product market because that would raise the profits of Coke and of Pepsi, and they own them both. And moreover, if you're a large owner of Coke or Pepsi, and I don't mean to pick on them, but any firm will do, you're supposed to engage in corporate governance. You're supposed to be speaking to executives and voting and designing compensation schemes and generally monitoring what management's doing. So there could be an action like the compensation contract for top management that the common owner has some control over and affects product market competition. And so the common owner has both the incentive to take that action and the ability to take that action to soften competition, raise profits, and benefit. Now, the action that softens competition is likely to vary across settings. It could be price, it could be advertising, it could be capacity, could be doing nothing in some settings. And we also know that expected future profits determine stock prices. So what Lyle and I do is we look at what happens when a company joins the S&P 500 index. Entry into the index causes the entrant stock price to go up, that's well known. But it also causes a sharp increase in the amount of common ownership between that entering firm and firms in its product market that are already members of the index. So think about Pepsi's already in the index, Coke joins. What we do is we look at the firm that's already in the index, Pepsi, and we ask what happens to its stock price, because if analysts think that expected future profits will be higher because of the common ownership, Pepsi's stock price should go up. If Iron Brew is outside this industry and doesn't have common owners with Coke and Pepsi, then nothing's going to happen to Iron Brew. And indeed, what we find is that stock prices go up with the amount of increase in common ownership. And we have the measure that we use that works the best in terms of predicting the stock prices is a vector similarity measure. You take all the owners and line them up, and you just see how similar the two vectors are. And that turns out to give you a nice prediction of the increase in stock price. So what do we learn from this? Well, we learn that traders out there think that profits will increase when common ownership rises, and we know that we have theory about incentive and ability, so probably if you're a policymaker, you should be looking at this and thinking about how to study it, how to measure it better, and maybe even how to solve it. So that's a preview of the papers, like the problem, how we got here, The papers showing us that the problem is very real and where it's located. Papers pointing out other problems that we haven't gotten very far in studying. And I wanted to then close with some thoughts on what industrial organization economists and all economists can do that's helpful going forward. So the first thing is to put the economics back into competition enforcement and show the need for it. Instead of writing things that, I don't know, aren't helpful or are somewhat orthogonal to this debate, I think there's just really a need for papers that are about the kinds of topics that competition authorities are grappling with, like monopsony, like innovation. And in particular, developing empirical evidence for propositions that we know are theoretically correct, but which courts or policymakers seem to have trouble accepting. And secondly, I would encourage everybody to work on translating your findings. If you have a paper like monopsony nurses or killer acquisitions, find a way to get those results out to a policy audience and a legal audience, and that might require a co-author or a blog or something. But if the findings don't get to that audience, then they're not having the impact that they otherwise could. I think particularly monopsony and competition in labor markets is a really important area. Demand system estimation that's more reliable, that's more robust, that we can use more readily in administrative hearings and legal settings. And then a lot more about innovation. I think we have many more products that we care about today that are the kind of thing that are cancer tests or handsets, and not as many that are ready-to-eat cereal and automobiles. And so we need metrics that tell us more about innovation, measuring innovation, the value of innovation, what's a nascent product, how do nascent competitors affect competition, how do entrepreneurs decide to enter an industry or not, that kind of thing. So that's the I.O. part. Then the second thing that needs to happen from the academics is work on digital platform regulation. The field of regulation, at least in the United States, became unpopular because in the 80s or late 70s, we deregulated everything, airlines, telecom, electricity. And all of those guys, I remember, who taught me regulation are all retired. And we do a little mechanism design today, but that's about, we don't really teach regulation. There's also a new area developing in theory that builds models of platforms and digital businesses and explains how platforms work. But that's quite a nascent literature. And these two need to be combined. We need platform literature and regulation thereof. And I think this is really the field of the future. The European Commission proposed the Digital Markets Act last December, and they're likely to vote on it this December. We are likely to have laws in Europe that actually control what these firms do. The same in the UK, but not the DMA, and I'll come back to the UK in a second. So this is the Digital Markets Act, and for example, it has rules like I forget what the preamble says, but the gatekeeper is prohibited from allowing business users to, must allow business users, to offer the same products or services to end users through third-party online intermediation services at prices or conditions that are different from those offered through the gatekeeper. So some of you in the room may recognize that to be a prohibition on MFNs. If you sell through me at a certain price or conditions, and there's a rival platform out there, the gatekeeper platform is not allowed to restrict the terms on which the app developer or the other service deals with the rival platform. So for example, Amazon used to have this rule for sellers on its marketplace. They couldn't sell at a lower price on a rival e-commerce platform. And the Germans enforced against that, and that's gone. Here are a couple more. The C says the end users that the core platform acquires should be allowed to interact with the app and the developer through other means, and the app developer should have access to those end users themselves without needing to go through the core platform service and without needing to pay 30% every time the end user does something on that platform. And it's essentially I think, responsive to the Google and Apple App Store situation. And you can see that these are just English language sentences that are going to apply to the 5 biggest platforms in the world. And I don't think anyone's written a model of item C and checked carefully about how it's going to work and in what settings will it work and will it really improve consumer welfare in all of those settings. F is about bundling, essentially. Do you have to sign in with Chrome in order to do a search? Do you have to get all your different products from Amazon? Do you have to sign in to one to get the other? Do you need to belong to Prime in order to get something else? So this is essentially a prohibition on bundling. There are 18 of these rules, okay? And they're about to be law in December. And there's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the analysis of this piece of legislation to figure out what it's going to do and how it's going to affect consumers, how it's going to affect competition, will it promote entry. In the UK, the need for research is actually even bigger. Why is that? Because the UK is not going to get the Digital Markets Act. The UK, the CMA is proposing legislation for next year to set up something called a Digital Markets Unit that's going to analyze platforms and assign them strategic market status or not. And if you have strategic market status, then the CMA is going to design bespoke regulation just for you. Okay, now, why is that maybe a good idea compared to what Europe is doing? The idea is to avoid unintended consequences. For example, a rule that is created with the Apple App Store in mind might somehow harm the entry of Amazon Fire if Amazon wants to make a phone, for example. I don't really know that that would be the case, but that's that one would worry that a blanket rule that applies to everybody could have unintended consequences. So it really matters for the CMA that they get this bespoke regulation right, and that means understanding the impact of this kind of regulation on a platform. The legislation will also allow for what they call pro-competitive interventions in markets to make them more competitive, and you want to think here about data portability rules and interoperability that would be imposed on a sector. So let's take social networking, Facebook, for example, and say, look, you have to work more like email. If there's a rival social network that wants to connect and send messages, you have to interoperate the way Hotmail sends messages to Gmail, sends messages to, Yale. So we need research to figure out what would be most beneficial to consumers there. And, okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is behavioral, but I'll just put the 3, I think, up on the slides so you see them and think about them. So the task number 1 is more competition economics research, put the economics back into competition enforcement, write a policy accessible version of the paper. And I think, as I said, monopsony, demand system, and innovation are the key. There are other topics too, but those I think are really urgent. The regulation of digital platforms, the DMA has 18 rules. You can write 18 or more papers, obviously. And there's plenty to estimate, I think, for empirical researchers also, although getting the right data is an issue. Platforms that are under litigation don't really want to share data, so this is a challenge, and thinking about creative ways to do that is going to be very valuable. And as I said, the UK, I think this research will be particularly useful to the UK because they're going to get to be more subtle in the way they do their regulation and therefore benefit even more from economic insights. And then the last one is consumer protection, digital consumer protection. We just really don't do this very well. There's a lot of dark patterns. I don't know if any of you have tried to unenroll from Amazon Prime. It takes about 10 minutes. The framing, the way these choices are framed for us on our little screens turn out to really exercise substantial control over choices. So what consumer protection rules do we need online? What evidence do we have from labs and experiments that consumers choose badly in this context? I mean, we have lots of evidence that consumers choose badly, but we need more that's specific to the digital environment. What kind of framing would help them choose better? If you could define a neutral choice architecture, what would that be? How could you prove that it was neutral and good for consumers? We want consumers to make choices that are consistent with their long-run future well-being. How do we figure out what that is? So we need evidence and results in setting of interest like dark patterns. I mean, there's been a lot of revelation this week that Facebook knew that their products cause mental health problems in teenagers, particularly girls, and they didn't do anything about it. And so that's obviously just a first-order problem, all of those issues. And so I've read a lot of papers about retirement savings and a lot of papers about going to the gym, and that's all nice. But I think that it's more sort of amusement, and this is really serious. Well, okay, retirement savings is also serious. But I think these sets of issues are quite difficult to solve and really, really important, since we intermediate a lot of our economic activity now through a screen that's the size of a hand. And so giving consumers the control they need to make good choices in that environment is hard and important. Okay, so that was all that I wanted to say tonight, and thought we could spend whatever balance of the time we have in discussion and questions. And thank you very much.